a letter in English saying, "Simon, darling, take care of yourself. We need you. We love you." And it was signed by Elizabeth Taylor. And so I thought, wow, exactly. Yes. And I said, wow, not because it was Elizabeth Taylor, which is wow enough, but not because of that, but because all of a sudden the drama of his life became so clear to me. How somebody from the lowest of the low, really you can't, there's nothing lower than somebody who has just come out of a concentration camp, how in relatively few years he becomes into a moral authority which is recognized all over the world. And so I thought, before I even entered all the other aspects of his life, all the adventures, all the disappointments, all the achievements, I just thought this is a very, very dramatic development of somebody's life. And so that's when I decided to do the book. I'm telling you this because since the book came out a few weeks ago, almost once a day somebody asks me, why have you decided to do a book on Simon Wiesenthal? And the answer is because he was very, very fascinating. In fact, Eileen and Susan asked me that on the way from the airport. I had just landed and already they asked me, why have you decided to do a book on Simon Wiesenthal? So I asked them, did you read the book? And they hadn't. So that's why you ask. But if you read it, then you would know what a very, very fascinating personality he was. And it's not only his personality which deserves this book to be written, but also the kind of questions which his life involves, such as being a survivor. What does it mean to be a survivor? What are the proper lessons of the Holocaust? What is the meaning of the Holocaust? What is the meaning of being Jewish in his case? And I will tell you how he got to that question. Questions of what is evil, what is guilt, what is forgiveness. All these things constantly preoccupied him in spite of the fact that he was no philosopher. We have, as you will see when we go out afterwards, very well in this picture, but interestingly enough, the German edition of the book, they did not dare to use that picture because they thought, well, it looks a little bit anti-Semitic, or it looks a little bit like we don't really want, and so they used a picture where you see him like a Jewish philosopher, holding his hand and his head in his hand and thinking. And he may have been flattered by that other picture, but he was not a philosopher, although he came across, as I said, very deep and philosophical questions, and the combination of a man who is a man of action, a man of adventures, a man of very daring operations sometimes, and is also a man whose life very much requires a lot of thinking and a lot of philosophical and historiographical questions. Wiesenthal was very much a man of his century. He was born in 1908 in a little town called Buchach, which is was in East Poland. Today it is in Ukraine. That's the same town in which the Israeli author Shai Agnon was born, who later received the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 1960s. And he lived long enough, so he was born in 1908. He was young enough to remember the first car he ever saw in his life as an experience. He could say, wow, I saw the first car. And he lived long enough to became old enough to protest against neo-Nazi games on the internet. So you really have the whole century there. And of course he remembered World War I, World War II, the rise of communism, the fall of communism, the rise of Nazism, the fall of Nazism, the post-World War, and so he was very much aware of himself as a man of the century and a man of history. After he graduated from high school, he began to study in what was then Poland, a town called Lvov. He studied architecture, but then the Nazis came to power, occupied Poland, and he went from one concentration camp to the other. All in all, 5 concentration camps. In the 1950s and in the 1960s did very, very little thinking about the Holocaust, and the Holocaust was a taboo really in Israel, a big silence around the Holocaust for a number of political and emotional and psychological reasons. Nobody talked about the Holocaust. Parents wouldn't tell their children, and children wouldn't dare to ask. And it only started to change with the Eichmann trial. So as part of that, the attitude of the Israeli Mossad also began to change. And what they do, beginning in the 1960s, they are beginning to support WEISENTHAL, which means that WEISENTHAL receives a monthly salary of about $300 from the agent of the Mossad in Austria. And the Mossad also finances his office in Vienna, and he even has a secret nickname in the internal correspondence, Theocrat, they called it. And that, to me, was a very big surprise, because my first reaction was, well, here is Simon Wiesenthal as an agent of the Israeli Mossad, and I had no idea. I was also surprised, pleasantly surprised, that the Mossad is finally doing something. They're not doing a lot, but at least they are helping Simon Wiesenthal. And when the book came out, this was a major headline in newspapers, actually all over the world, here first in the New York Times and then in other major newspapers all over the world. Everybody, the headline was everywhere: famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal was a Mossad agent. And you can imagine that in Austria they were particularly happy about that, because they said, aha, he was a spy, he was an agent, he was not an Austrian patriot as he always pretended to be. And I went to Austria and told them that actually they have it all wrong. It's not that Wiesenthal worked for the Mossad. In reality, the Mossad worked for Wiesenthal. And they kind of accepted that. But I think that Wiesenthal would have been unhappy about the reaction in Austria, because there was nothing he wanted more than to be accepted as an Austrian patriot. Again, it took me a very, very long time to reach that conclusion. Sold the media, not sold, but told the media stories which were not true. And the reason why he did that, there were 2 major reasons why he did that. A, he had a very big ego, and he liked the publicity, he liked to be famous. But the other more important reason was that whenever he appears on television or in a major newspaper, he receives information that people know about him, and they call him or they write letters to him. Very often tips about possible Nazi criminals, and more often information from Holocaust survivors. Holocaust survivors very often needed him as an ear. And so they would write to him or call him and tell him about their experiences. And he wrote down their names and their addresses. And so very often judiciary authorities in Germany and in Austria would turn to him and say, we have this criminal, we are opening this trial, but we have no witnesses. And he would say, yes, for that ghetto, I have a witness who lives in Miami, Florida, or in Cleveland, Ohio, or in Hadera, Israel, or whatever. So the list of criminals which he put together was not the major thing. The list of survivors was even more important. And beginning in the 1960s, that was the major thing he did. He spent many, many hours. The routine of his work was very unheroic. He was sitting in his office. He read old newspapers. He read old documents. He read old telephone books. And he tried to locate people where he knew names of criminals and where can they be. So it was a very gray activity, but to the outside, he always tried to present it as a much more adventurous than it actually was. Many, many cases in the office, when you go to the office today, you find many thousands of names, but of course there are not thousands of people who were brought to trial and convicted thanks to his efforts. In fact, he very often lived from one disappointment to the other. Again, because the Austrian authorities and the German authorities did very, very little to follow up the information which he gave them. So in the liberal system of justice, liberal in the European sense of the word, he was against revenge. He did not want to see any Nazi criminal being shot in a dark alley. He wants them to be brought to trial. And again he had to see that this system, this judicial system, is just inadequate. It's not good enough, because the accused is always presumed innocent. He can always bring defense lawyers, and these defense lawyers would treat Holocaust survivors very, very badly, and very often turn the survivors into accused. An old man would come from Israel, not speaking German very well. He would probably speak Yiddish better, and it would be very, very difficult for him to go to Germany anyway, to face the Nazi criminal anyway. And then these young German attorneys would start asking him questions, as is okay in a court to do. They would ask him, you say that this man hit you. Did he hit you from the right? Was he wearing a brown uniform or a green uniform or a black uniform? A brown uniform, so it can't be my man because his unit was wearing green uniforms. Did he hit you from the right or did he hit you from the left? He hit you from the right. Well, it can't be him because he's a left-hander. Was it in the morning or in the evening? In the morning. Maybe the sun, maybe you didn't really see him, maybe you don't recognize him. How do you know his name? Do you know all the names of all the things like that, in a very, very cruel way, and very often people were acquitted. Most Nazi criminals who were put on trial were acquitted. So Wiesenthal lived from one disappointment to the other, and still he believed in the system of justice. And this belief of his in the system of justice was part of his general humanistic approach to the Holocaust. Wiesenthal was a humanist in the sense that the extermination of the Jews to him were primarily a crime against humanity. Against Jews as part of humanity, but it was primarily a crime against humanity. He did not hesitate to compare the Holocaust with other genocides, including those that happened after World War II, Rwanda or wherever. And he also talked a lot about